This is Dr. Ben White with the Rational Wellness Podcast, bringing you the cutting-edge information on health and nutrition from the latest scientific research and by interviewing the top experts in the field. Please subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast on iTunes and YouTube, and sign up for my free ebook on my website by going to drwhites.com. Let's get started on your road to better health. Hello, Rational Wellness Podcasters. Thank you so much for joining me again today. And for those of you who enjoy listening to the Rational Wellness Podcast, please go to iTunes and give us a ratings and review. That way more people will find out about the Rational Wellness Podcast. Our topic for today is healthy fish. And we'll be speaking to Randy Hartnell, the founder and president of Vital Choice Wild Seafood and Organics, a company dedicated to bringing to the public top quality seafood that has lower levels of hazardous contaminants like mercury. There are many questions today about whether it's healthy to eat fish and seafood. On the one hand, many scientific studies have shown that eating fish and seafood promotes better health. And even more studies demonstrate the health benefits of omega-3 fats from fish and seafood. We know that seafood, especially certain types like wild salmon, not only contain quality protein, but many vitamins and minerals, including fat-soluble vitamins D, A, B vitamins, and are the absolute best source for omega-3 fats that promote cardiovascular health, reduce inflammation, and have so many other health-promoting benefits. This is why I eat seafood at least several times per week, and I recommend it for my patients. On the other hand, we have many concerns about eating fish today for a number of reasons. Toxic chemicals that humans have been dumping into the oceans for decades, like mining waste, agricultural runoff, industrial waste, mercury, etc. Oil spills, nuclear radiation from Fukushima. We've probably all seen the reports about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch of floating plastic. Recent reports about microparticles of plastic found in fish. There's questions about the sustainability of fish in the oceans. Farm fish versus wild fish. There's an issue with the genetically modified salmon that's on the market now. And also reports that when you go to buy seafood, many of it is mislabeled. It's farmed and it's labeled as wild or labeled as the wrong species. Randy, thank you so much for joining us today. Maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you came to start this seafood company, Vital Choice.
Well, thank you, Dr. White. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and address some of these many questions. There's a lot of confusion around seafood, so I always appreciate the opportunity to bring some clarity to it. Well, I started as a commercial fisherman back in my college days. My dad worked up in Alaska as a port engineer, and he got me a job at a cannery and got me a job on a boat. And so I financed my way through college as a fisherman in Alaska. I had planned to go on to grad school, but basically I fell in love with fishing and took that up as a full-time profession and ended up doing that for over 20 years. And then about late 1990s, early 2000s, something disrupted our industry, and I basically had to move on and do something else. That something was farmed industrial salmon. It basically took over the world markets for salmon, and I got to the end of the 2000 season, I think, and we'd caught a lot of fish, but nobody wanted to buy them. And it was the first time in all my years as a fisherman I couldn't afford to pay my crew, I couldn't pay my bills, and so I moved on. I ended up transitioning from catching fish into marketing fish. I started a company called Vital Choice, and my mission was to, on one hand, educate people about the differences between wild and farm salmon, and then also to provide them with a preferable alternative, provide them with access to wild salmon. So that's what we've been doing ever since, almost 18 years now.
Cool. So let's talk about, maybe we can talk about some of the health benefits of eating fish on a regular basis.
One of the interesting things that happened when I started this company was I was selling direct to consumers. And so I had a one-on-one relationship with my customers, and they had lots of questions. And all those years that I was a fisherman, I didn't know an omega-3 from anything. I just had never heard of omega-3. So I needed to do a lot of studying, and basically that continues until today. I've read just about every book on omega-3s, and there are a lot of them out there, and all the health benefits of seafood. As you know, then the seafood is probably one of the few foods out there that pretty much everybody agrees is healthy if you get the right versions of it.
Right.
So seafood has been in the human diet from the very beginning. You know, our bodies are constructed of these marine omega-3 molecules, and we still need them. They're still essential. And seafood is really the only place you can get them, or products from the marine food web.
Can you explain why the fish that you're offering is healthier than what a lot of others are selling, such as the canned baby salmon that's lower in mercury?
Well, I think there's some confusion there. I don't know of anybody that's selling canned baby salmon.
Okay.
Salmon are a relatively short-lived species, so even if you get a grown-up salmon, it's going to be fairly, only 4 years old. It's going to have very relatively low mercury levels. Where the younger fish come in is with a longer-lived species, so like a halibut or a tuna. They can live many years. They can get huge. So if you're going to the market to buy fish for your family, and you're aware of this contaminant issue, you're going to choose the smaller fish. And so that's what we do. We just buy the kinds of fish that we want to feed our families, and we know that our customers appreciate. And when it comes to those longer-lived fish, that means that you want the smaller ones.
Oh, okay. I thought that you had some sort of salmon that had less mercury in it.
No, I think what you're thinking about is, because we have a lot of fans for our product called our Ventresca.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Or tuna. And
tuna. Okay.
It's albacore tuna.
That's what I meant. Yes. Yeah.
A lot of people, health experts tell people just avoid tuna. And it's such an unfair generalization, because there are 800-pound tuna that have sky-high mercury levels, and there are 3-pound, 5-pound skipjack tuna that are 2 or 3 years old that have relatively low levels and, relatively high omega-3 levels. So it's not fair to the fishery, to the industry, to the community out there for just to tell people to avoid all tuna. It really is based on a lack of knowledge about that type of fish.
Right. So you're using the younger tuna, and those are much lower in mercury, right? That's
right. Yeah, the University of Oregon, I believe, did a study with albacore caught off the coast of Oregon, Northwest Washington, where they drew a correlation between tuna size or age and mercury levels. Now, generally the smaller fish have lower mercury levels. The interesting thing is they also have higher omega-3 levels. In our experience, just remarkably high fat levels in these younger tuna. And when I first went down to the dock to meet our fisherman, his name is Paul Hill, and he's second generation tuna fisherman. I told him we only wanted to buy his small fish, and he just couldn't wrap his brain around that. He said, my whole life, my dad's whole career, the buyers told us that the small fish were trash, and they wouldn't pay us anything for them. And you're telling me that's all you want? And that's all we've been doing now for probably 16 years.
Oh, interesting.
Great for him, because the big buyers, they want the bigger fish. The yields are higher; they're less costly to process. Our customers are more focused on the purity and the health benefits, and those are both delivered in a superior way by the younger fish.
Oh, okay.
One thing I want to clarify is he's not out there targeting little fish, right? He's just catching fish, and they're part of every load. And so when he comes in, he size grades.
Oh, okay.
Take the small ones. So
you're not going after the tuna nursery schools, then.
That's right.
I figured you just wait until the tuna come across the border and then you separate the mothers from the baby. No, I'm kidding. Okay. So what about some of the reports that some of the seafood is mislabeled when you go to buy it?
That's been going on for forever because it's really easy to bait and switch people. I like to tell this story of many years ago. I was back, and not, like I said, things haven't changed that much, so it's still applicable. I was back in New York City in the Fulton Fish Market, and I met Dr. Andrew Weil. I was going to show him around the fish market, and we had a video crew with us. And we walked into this one stall, and Slavin & Sons, I believe it was. And I noticed, this was in November, which is not wild salmon season. And I noticed all these pallets of boxes piled high with, and on the end of the box said wild king salmon. And so I asked him where, I think it was a grandson of the founder. I said, where in the world are you getting all this fresh wild king salmon this time of the year? And he goes, why, those are farmed wild king salmon. People don't want to pay for real wild king salmon. And I went back and wrote an article in our newsletter about it. And Marion Burroughs at the New York Times somehow got that. And she called me up and she said, well, we want to do an investigative report about this. And so sure enough, a few weeks later, front page of the Sunday New York Times was a big story about bait and switch. But fast forward to, I think just last year or two, there was a big study done in California, basically showing that half the fish in sushi bars is mislabeled. There was one species, like an Asian carp or something, that was labeled as more than a dozen different types of other fish.
Wow.
And then, of course, one of the most common examples that I run into is in restaurants. As more and more consumers become educated and they're requesting wild salmon, they understand the differences. The less scrupulous restaurants are just calling their farm salmon wild. And I can't tell you the number of times I've gone in, it said wild salmon on the menu. I've ordered, it's clearly not been wild salmon. And so it's just something people have to be aware of. And
now, can you tell just by looking at it? Are there things that the consumers can detect?
It's really tough. I mean, I probably eat more salmon than just about anybody on the planet, and caught millions of pounds of salmon, and I can't always tell.
The color seems to be different, right?
Well, the aquaculture industry has done a good job of mimicking wild salmon color. The farm salmon they're not eating what wild salmon are eating. They're not getting the krill and the phytoplankton.
Right, that's one of the main issues, right? The fish are getting the omega-3s because of what they're eating. And
so their diet, the farm salmon diet is supplemented with a synthetic version of that compound that will turn the fish flesh the color that resembles wild.
Yeah, essentially they're dyeing the fish pink.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. Right.
And so those farm fish are being fed, much less healthy sources of nutrition. Isn't that right?
In the early days when we were first starting, the big criticism, the primary criticism against farm salmon was that it had much higher levels of contaminants, a lot more PCBs, and
right.
And that was because they were being fed predominantly rendered fish feed. So they'd go out and catch tons of anchovies and sardines. They would render them down into pellets. And while those individual sardines and anchovies just had minuscule levels of contaminants, when you render them down and concentrate them in pellets, you're concentrating all those contaminants. And then you start feeding basically livestock fish its entire life, then it accumulates. So and also fish feed like that is very expensive, relatively expensive. And so there were two challenges. It was expensive, and it was giving the farm salmon high contaminant levels. So how do you address that? Well, you find cheaper feed that doesn't have contaminants in it. And that, just like every other livestock, turns out to be grains. And so farm salmon now have been fed increasing amounts of grain products. And I'm sure that the aquaculture scientists are trying to figure out, how they can get away feeding pretty much all, because it's the cheapest possible thing you can feed them. And but consequently, the farm salmon fat profile no longer mimics a wild salmon. It has much higher levels of omega-6s from the grains. And I'm speaking generally here. There may be exceptions. I'm sure there are salmon farmers out there that are trying to do the right thing, trying to do it.
Yeah, but for those of us in the functional medicine world, many of us are trying to stay away from grains and advising our patients to stay away from grains. And then we go eat fish and to find out that the fish actually contain inflammatory omega-6s because they ate grains, and potentially we may be exposed to some of the same immune issues that some of us have when we react to
so wild salmon, say a wild sockeye salmon, has roughly 9 omega-3s for every omega-6. King salmon might be 6 to 1, but basically wild salmon, you're getting a lot more omega-3s than you are 6s. A farm salmon is, last I heard, was roughly 1 to 1. So if you're trying to improve that ratio, it's pretty hard to do with farm salmon.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How about being able to detect other fish, one species from the other? Are there any hints that we can use if we go to a fish market?
Ben, the best way to protect yourself is just find a good fishmonger that you can trust, or find a good restaurant where the person running it really knows what he's doing. Problem is, people are often driven by price. And when you want the cheapest anything, you go to places that generally don't hire the most knowledgeable people. They're just trying to move product, and they don't know what they're selling. I'm talking about a fish counter or a restaurant.
Yeah.
That's really, I think, the safest way. I figure out which restaurants I know that I can trust, that care about their reputation, and would never, bait and switch a customer. And that's who we try to be for our customers. As far as, you go into a sushi bar and they tell you it's, some whitefish. How in the heck are you going to know unless you do a DNA test on it?
Yeah.
The answer to your original question is it's really difficult for people to know, and that's why it's so common. That's why it's so many people get away with it, because there are very few penalties for people that get caught other than their reputation.
So we can order fish frozen through your company?
Yeah, we have a broad line of frozen, premium Alaskan frozen seafood, and then we also have canned and pouched seafood, and our product line has really expanded over the years. We've also got other proteins, but seafood is still our passion and what we do. Now, we just, to put it as simply as possible, my wife and I started the company. My brother and sister still work in the company. We've grown quite a bit, but really we're just buying products that we want to eat ourselves, that we can trust, and we apply that standard to everything that we buy.
What about some of the reports of the plastics? And there's recently been a bunch of reports about micro particles of plastic in fish.
It's definitely concerning. It's a horrible problem. How it impacts, salmon in Alaska. I haven't seen any evidence that it's impacting them. Although, of course, all of our oceans are, none of them are pristine anymore. And one of our big missions from the start is, what can we do to protect the seafood resource, to protect the oceans? Most of our charitable efforts over the years have gone toward environmental organizations working to protect the ocean. And one personal mission I have is just by educating people like you do about how incredibly important seafood is. Hopefully people will start to make the connection. Well, if we don't have healthy oceans, we're not going to have seafood. And if we don't have seafood, we're not going to be as healthy and have it to enjoy. And it's already happening in many parts of the world.
Yeah, I hear these discussions sometimes where you get these really smart people like Elon Musk and even Stephen Hawking before he died recently, talking about how we need to explore Mars because we'll probably have to leave the planet because we're destroying it. And it's just insane to think, why don't we just protect it? That would make a lot more sense.
Once we get there, too. Right.
Right.
Well, there won't be any oceans to mess up. I think there's room for both. And I do see some encouraging signs that, there are more and more people becoming aware of these problems and more people working on solutions. So hopefully they will be successful.
What do you think about this new genetically modified salmon? What's it called? The Aqua Bounty or something like that?
Well, that's sort of been on our radar for more than 10 years. And what to say about it?
Well, it grows twice as fast as other salmon.
It's not available in American markets now that I'm aware of. There's been such a pushback from the consumer that, to my knowledge, it's not available.
But once the species is out in the public, in the wild, I know they say they're going to keep it contained, but, my worry is it's going to take over,
I maybe have some good news there because these are Atlantic salmon. Samo salar is the species.
Okay.
I live in the Pacific Northwest, so we have 5 different wild salmon species that populate this region. And years ago, somebody thought it was a good idea. Let's bring in some Atlantic salmon and plant them and see if we can get them going. Then we'll have 6 species of wild. And they tried multiple times to bring in, healthy, truly wild Atlantic salmon, and they just would not take. They've never been able to survive. So I think that's one fear that is probably not that serious. They will, I'm sure if they escape, and sometimes the Atlantic salmon, often the Atlantic salmon farms will have escapes. Just last year here in Washington State, hundreds of thousands of wild salmon got out. But there's no evidence that they're displacing the wild salmon. They're finding them with empty bellies. They've been fed their whole lives, for generations. They've been hand-fed, machine-fed, whatever it is. And so I'm not an expert, but what I do pay attention, and I've never seen any evidence that they are displacing the wild salmon. There are a lot of other concerns, habitat destruction, but I don't think GMO salmon present that much of a risk to the wild salmon.
Well, that's good. What about some of the issues about overfishing and sustainability?
Yeah, that's a huge problem around the world, but there's good news there on several fronts. Over the last 10 years, there's been an increased consumer focus on that issue. And there's one organization, there's probably 30 different organizations focused on sustainable seafood, and it's growing all the time. It's confusing for consumers because there's so many different ones, and some of them sort of have maybe less than noble agendas. But there's one that's sort of the gold standard, and we were one of their first licensees way back in 2002. That's the Marine Stewardship Council. And basically what they do is they will go in and assess a fishery and look at the impact of a particular fishery on other species. It's very rigorous. It takes years to get a fishery certified as being sustainably managed. And so Alaska was the first fishery statewide. All their salmon were certified by the Marine Stewardship Council. And there's a little blue logo you can find. If you go to msc.org, you can learn a lot more about it. But the result is more and more consumers are looking for sustainable seafood. And it's kind of like we talked about earlier. If you go to stores and restaurants that have made their business about sourcing only sustainable seafood, then you can pretty much trust that you're getting fish that are coming from responsibly managed fisheries. We only source fisheries from healthy, sustainable sources. Alaska is really a model for the world. A lot of people are unaware of this, but Alaska pursued statehood in part to take control of their fisheries back from the federal government, which was mismanaging them. Imagine that. And they wrote right into their founding constitution that all the fish resources would be managed on a sustainable yield basis. Basically what that means is scientists, biologists are in charge of those salmon runs. And so they're severed, they're isolated from the market. No matter how much the market demand is for wild salmon, the scientists are going to dictate how many are caught. And then they'll take those that are caught and they go out into the market. Just this year, or last couple of years in Bristol Bay, Alaska, where I used to fish, they've had the biggest runs they've ever seen, since they've been keeping track. And over
cool.
50, 60 million salmon coming back. It's just an amazing story.
Is there any increasing demand for wild salmon now that people are more educated about its benefits?
Huge. Because back when I was a fisherman, if we had a big run like this, our price would collapse. And then farm salmon came along and people would just buy farm salmon. But now a lot of people have been, are a lot more knowledgeable about farm salmon. They want wild and they'll pay more to get wild. So now the fishermen are doing really well. Even though there was the biggest run they've had in 50 years, the price was almost as high as it's ever been. And so the fishermen are doing a good job and being well rewarded for it. That was another part of our mission, was to educate people about the differences so that they would create demand, drive the price up. Because fishermen, or the whole fishing industry, is really the most vocal political advocate for the salmon resource. There are all kinds of competing industries that want to come in and destroy the Alaska salmon habitat, just like they have in the rest of the
Yeah, you keep reading reports about how they're opening up more mining and more oil drilling off the coast of Alaska, and it's kind of scary.
And we have a saying: if you want to save wild salmon, you need to eat wild salmon. Save wild, eat wild, because a healthy seafood industry, salmon industry, is last line of defense for these wild salmon. If your livelihood depends on catching these fish, then you're going to do everything you can to make sure they're managed responsibly, that the habitat is protected. And so far they've been successful at fending off this $1 trillion mine. I mean, this mine that they want to put in, it's called the Pebble Mine up in Bristol.
I heard about that. Wasn't that just approved again or something?
Well, with the current administration, they're not big defenders of the environment. And so yes, they did. But I don't think that, as long as you've got $1 trillion worth of minerals sitting in the ground, the fight is never going to be over, right? But it was those fishermen, those natives, all of the native communities along there that, just made passionate pleas and reached out and got help from a lot of the bigger environmental organizations and politicians and commerce. Tiffany said, we will never buy gold from those mines up there. They're just one example of many, but it was the fishermen that really were the heart and soul of that fight and continue to be.
Well, that's good. Good to get some positive thoughts about that. So everybody get out there and eat your wild salmon.
Well, the one last thing I want to say about the sustainability issue, there's a book called Perfect Protein by Andy Sharpless, who is the CEO of Oceana.
Okay.
And he points out that the sustainability movement that's been underfoot is really having a positive impact, and fisheries around the world are stabilizing. Because if you're out there harvesting fish that in an unsustainable way, you're overcatching or whatever, and the market doesn't want those, then that's going to force you to clean up your act. And that's basically what's been happening. There's still bad actors out there, of course, and there's still some sort of black holes where we don't really know what's going on. But by and large, there have been a lot of fisheries that have recovered and are doing better. Now we just need to focus on cleaning up the ocean.
When it comes to sourcing omega-3s, some of the companies go, oh, our omega-3s are from more sustainable sources, and some are from krill, and some are from Norwegian fish, some are from squid and things like that. From the standpoint of sustainability, what's the truth about the best place to source your omega-3s?
Well, I you know more about this than I do probably, but I don't think that anybody will tell you that the best form of omega-3s is in food.
No, I know, but if you are going to say use fish oil capsules, is it like is krill a problem because that's what the whales eat, or is it better?
That's a great question. That's a really great question. The thing about krill oil is it's all the rage in the nutrition and health world, but consumption of krill oil is relatively minuscule compared to the population of krill. I mean, there's a massive krill biomass in the Antarctic, and the total allowable catch is like a thin slice of that pie. And the amount that's actually caught is a super thin slice of that pie. So they're not even approaching the total amount that they're allowed to catch, conservative guidelines. So the Marine Stewardship Council, as a result, has looked at that and from a scientific perspective, and they have certified krill oil. We were the very first krill oil, actually. I happened to be in the offices of the Marine Stewardship Council in London the day the approval came through, and I said, wow, this is great. We can add MSC-certified krill oil, because Whole Foods had stopped selling krill oil because of the concerns that you mentioned. And it's one of those things where it was a PR. It was kind of a greenwashing PR move, or at least they were holding off until they, were convinced that it was a sustainable product. So anyway.
What about fish oil from, say, squid versus fish? Is there an issue of sustainability there? Does it make a difference, you think?
It depends on where the fish, where the fish are coming from. So a lot of the fish oil comes from the big anchovy fisheries in Peru. It's one of the biggest fisheries in the world. And by fish, I mean just, a regional specific type of fish in a certain region. And I've listened to a woman from Peru who manages their fisheries down there talk about how it would be so much better if we consume these fish, these incredible omega-3 rich fish, as food rather than rendering it down and feeding it to salmon, right? Which is where a lot of it goes, or turning it into fish oil for humans. And you're just better off eating a can of sardines than eating the fish oil. So we have supplements. We have fish oil, sockeye salmon oil, but I just eat fish almost every day or several times a week like you do, because that's the best source of omega-3s. And if you're eating a sustainable fish, then that addresses your question. As far as the quality of omega-3s from squid versus green lip mussels versus salmon or, whatever, sardines, I don't know. My sense is, and I've talked to a lot of scientists and lipid scientists, and their opinion is essentially an EPA or DHA omega-3 molecule. Doesn't really matter where you get it from a nutritional standpoint.
Yeah.
Although the krill oil is in phospholipid form, so there's some case that's more bioavailable. But nothing is more bioavailable than the omega-3s you get in the fish itself.
Right. So the conclusion really is just eat more fish.
Eat more sustainable fish.
Sustainable.
Salmon and sardines and whatnot.
Yeah. Those are the fish that I tend to eat the most as well. Okay, great. So how can our listeners and viewers find out more about your products, order your products?
Go to vitalchoice.com. And we have tons of information. We're really passionate about education. We have a free newsletter that so we do science-based articles about the environment. It's just a lot of these things we've talked about. There's also specials for the products. We have absolutely fantastic customer service. So you can call us 24/7 and talk to knowledgeable customer reps about these products. And we have a 100% money-back guarantee if you don't like. So we have a lot of pressure on us to make sure that what we send people is good. And I think there are close to over 11,000 reviews on our website now.
That's great. And what's the low mercury tuna called again?
Well, I'll tell you, but it's probably not going to be in stock. We can't keep it in stock.
Oh, is that right? Wow.
We call it ventresca.
Yes.
For the belly of the young tuna. But just all of our canned albacore tuna is fantastic. It's a super good source of omega-3s. It's coming from those smaller fish. So it's going to be the best sort of risk-reward ratio there. And I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I didn't want to go without giving you an opportunity to discuss the whole mercury radiation.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Let's go into it.
So
why don't we start with the mercury? And my understanding is most of the mercury is being dumped into the ocean from coal-fired powered plants, right?
One thing that's interesting is that a lot of at least half of the methyl mercury that's in the oceans is from natural sources. It's eroded, the land masses over the eons have eroded down, and they've found remains of Inuit Eskimos 10,000 years old, and they do hair analysis and they find mercury in their hair. So
really?
It's not like this mercury is a new thing. In fact, it's always been there in the marine environment, and life evolved in the ocean.
Because people are always talking about coal-fired power plants spewing hundreds of tons of mercury into the atmosphere, which then falls down into the ocean.
I'm not saying that's not a factor. I'm sure that is a factor, and it also makes for a great copy if you're trying to raise funds for your environmental organization. Follow the money, right? So it is a legitimate concern, but honestly, we are burning at least we are burning less coal, and that's a good thing. And
right.
Other parts of the world aren't. Anyway, the main takeaway here is if you look at people who eat the most seafood in the world, take Japan, for example, 80 plus million people that eat seafood many, many times a week. Pregnant women eat seafood many times a week. They're not the sickest people on the planet. You don't find mercury toxicity. You find that they're some of the healthiest, longest living, lowest, and it's complex. It's not only the fact that they're eating a lot of seafood, and there are other things that maybe they're not doing. They're not eating an American diet or as much. We are exporting our bad food over there too, I guess. But
we're exporting our rates of diabetes and heart disease and cancer as well.
But the bottom line is, they have some of the lowest infant mortality. They live the longest, lowest amount of different types of common diseases that we have. You go to a place like the Seychelles Islands, where seafood is pretty much their primary protein. They're eating 15, 16 times as much seafood as most Americans. And there's been a study run by the University of Rochester, I think. For close to 30 years, they've been looking at these people. And they tested the mothers when they were pregnant for mercury levels. And yes, some of them had higher mercury levels that correlated to higher fish consumption. And they fully assumed that as these kids got older, were born and got older, that the kids born to the moms with the highest mercury levels would have the most developmental problems. And they found no correlation. And they did a study with 14,000 mother-child pairs in the UK. Same thing. It turned out that the kids born to moms who ate the most fish had the least developmental problems. Moms had the higher mercury levels, but the kids had the least developmental problems. Those are two very rigorous studies showing that these trace levels of mercury that people freak out about are at least for most people, not an issue.
And are you suggesting that's because the levels are just not high enough to really cause problems, or?
There's so one hypothesis is that life evolved in the oceans amid a background of methyl mercury. And so it developed a way to deal with it. And the way that it deals with it is selenium. Selenium binds with methyl mercury and basically renders it harmless. And seafood is one of the richest sources of selenium. So in a sense, we've got a lot about this on our website. If you just go to our website and type in selenium or methyl mercury, there's just a lot of information. There are videos, but basically that's one hypothesis, that when you eat seafood, when you get methyl mercury from seafood, the concentrations are so low that the selenium basically is the antidote to that. As opposed to if you get mercury toxicity from industrial accidents, or a lot of people like to talk about Minamata and the horrendous birth defects that came from the Minamata industrial accident in Minamata, Japan, just horrible birth defects in the kids. But the levels of mercury that were in those fish in that area they're just orders of magnitude higher than anything you'd get in common seafood. So one of my closest friends at NIH has studied this. He's one of the authors of this study in the UK. His name is Dr. Joe Hibbland. And he said, mercury is just not an issue in most common seafood. Yeah, you want to avoid the shark and the big billfish, the long-lived, high in the food
swordfish,
but the sardines and the salmon and the kind of fish you find in most supermarkets, the benefits just so vastly outweigh the risks. And he even concluded in his paper that was published in The Lancet that advice, especially to pregnant and nursing women, to avoid seafood risks causing the harm you're trying to prevent. So you're telling women, and I had a friend, his name is Barton Seaver. He's written a bunch of books on seafood from the East Coast. And they just had a child here a year or two ago, and they went to the OBGYN, and they looked for the best OBGYN in that Boston area. And she said, they went in and she told his wife, don't eat any seafood while you're pregnant. And this still is going on out there. And so their conclusion, based on 14,000 mother-child pairs, was when you give that mother that advice, you risk causing cognitive deficits that you're trying to avoid. So they're well intended, but they're just not up to speed on where the science is.
Okay. What about some of the other toxins?
So the PCB, I think it kind of applies. It's about we used to do a lot of testing on our Alaskan seafood, and we just saw the same basically low results every time. We never had a spike. So, a pink salmon is only out in the ocean for 2 years. That's its life cycle, 2 years. A sockeye salmon, 4 years. Maybe a king salmon will live 6 years, but they're not like these longer lived fish like a Chilean sea bass or a halibut or, whatever.
And Chilean sea bass is on the list of fish that are among the highest in mercury now.
Well, I was just looking at that yesterday because there is now an MSC certified Chilean sea bass, and we've had a lot of requests for it. But again, it lives a long time. And so if you look at the studies, it has super high mercury levels if you get the bigger ones. And that's typically what industry wants. They want the bigger ones because they're cheaper to process. But if you get the little ones, they're comparable to an albacore tuna or something. So not that bad. The big takeaway is just risk versus reward. And, these nutrients, like a wild salmon is, I never heard anybody make a case that there's any other food on the planet that's more nutrient dense than a wild salmon. You've got all the fats, the proteins, the micronutrients. It's just incredibly nutrient dense type of food. And yeah, there are going to be trace levels of mercury and maybe some other contaminants, but we've got to eat something.
What about all these plastics? I mean, some of these reports on the plastic stuff is pretty scary.
I talked to this Dr. Ray Hilborn at the University of Washington. He's a fisheries expert. He's written a lot of books. And he's one of the leading scientists in fisheries about this. And from a nutritional standpoint, he wasn't aware of any evidence that there's harm. I think it's a matter of choosing species that are coming from the cleanest areas. And I think if the fish is ingesting the plastic, typically it's going to pass through the gut and not make its way into the flesh. I haven't seen any evidence that it is.
Well, these new articles about the microparticles,
it's concerning. I'm not.
We got to do something about these just floating patches of plastic. It's just incredible. I can't believe we're not concerned about it.
Well, I think there are a lot of people that are concerned about it, and they just hauled a bunch of big. I don't know if you've seen the story about the young guy that came up with this idea about how to collect it and
Oh, I saw the commercials where these two guys are diving under the water and picking up plastic and stuff.
Yeah, there's an organization that we support called Plastic Bank. And in fact, I just saw an American Express commercial that featured them, which is pretty cool. They're just based up in Vancouver, an hour from us. They've come up with this model where they go to sort of a lot of the areas around the world where plastic accumulates on the beach, and it's pretty horrendous in a lot of places, like Bali, and I mean, just you think of these tropical paradise, and they've just been destroyed by all this plastic. Well, they go in and they basically created an economy around the plastic. So they pay people to go out and pick up plastic on the beaches, and then they haul it back to these recycling centers that they set up. And so that's Plastic Bank. I don't know if it's .org or .com, but and there are just more and more of those kinds of efforts springing up. I look at it as they say all progress starts with the truth, and we have to start acknowledging, what we're doing to the oceans, and also realize how vitally important the oceans are to our own well-being. You can't have a healthy planet, healthy population without healthy oceans. So we're working to educate people and do what we can to support that.
Excellent. So I think that's a good note to end on. We need to have healthy oceans to have a healthy planet, and we need a healthy planet to have healthy human beings.
That's right. That's right. So that's why we called our company Vital Choice. It's a vital choice to choose the right seafood from the right fish.
Well, sounds like you're on a good mission, and I know you have a great product. So thank you for bringing some information about fish and seafood to us, Randy.
Thank you, Ben. Really a pleasure.